Welcome to Draw This. Draw This is a series of videos where I'll draw a random word for you while describing my process so that you, the viewer, can follow along. So today's random word is room. I'm going to draw the interior of a room, and I'm going to do it in sort of an interior design style. Just a rough sketch with some simple color. And I'm using Corel Painter 2015. I'm going to use a canvas that is 24 by 18 inches at 150 dpi, but you could use any size canvas you want. I'm going to create a new layer, and we're going to call this Sketch. And the brush that I'm going to use is called Rough Ink, and it's a brush that uses the jitter smoothing feature to make a nice, natural, organic line with some variance in it. We'll want to make our brush pretty thin, maybe something like 6, and you could use a gray to make it look more like pencil, or if you want it to look more like ink, you could use black. I'm going to use this 9 value here, which is just black. And then we're going to turn on perspective guides by clicking on this tool here and click the on button to turn it on. Change your preset to 2-point general composition. This red line defines your eye line or the horizon line, or the eye line of the observer. You can move this up or down if you want, but we're just going to leave it right here in this painting. And you have 2 vanishing points that are off to the sides. So we're going to go ahead and start sketching here using this rough ink. So the first thing we want to do is we want to just define the overall room. So we can pick a point here and we can draw a line. If you're not getting these perspective guided strokes, make sure you toggle this option on here. So I'm following these 2 green lines that are here, and then where they meet, I'm going to draw a vertical line. So this is going to be the corner of the room. We'll have the ceiling corner up here. A lot of this is going to be lines that we'll keep, and then some of the lines we'll erase. So in this room, we're going to want to have some windows. Let's say that the windows are going to be, the top edge of the window is going to be here. We'll mirror that on the other side so that when we put the window on the other side, it'll line up perfectly. I'm using lighter pressure for these because I want these to be guides. If you find that your line's not going the right way, just do an undo and do a couple more tries and try to paint more toward the direction that you want to go. So we'll have a window edge right there, and the window will be this wide. We'll decide where we want the window on the other side. We'll have it here and here for the edge. We'll give the window a little depth so it looks like it's inset. We'll go ahead and do a vertical line. We'll do a diagonal line that intersects with that line. And we'll do that top edge there. You want your edges to line up pretty well, so if you need to zoom in, go ahead and zoom in. Do the same thing on the other side. You really kind of have to eyeball this because it's hard to get things perfectly equal if you're not careful. So just do a few undos until you think you got it right. There's the edge for that window. And then we'll have a light fixture up here at the top. We'll go ahead and put in a dresser. So the easiest thing to do is to go ahead and decide where some of these things attach. So you would draw the base of the dresser first. That way you can space it out from the wall as far as you want it. So let's say it's going to be this far from the wall, and it's going to come out from the wall probably to about here. We'll draw our sides. If you don't get it right, you can go ahead and make it a little bit wider. I see it needs to be a bit wider. That looks better to me. Again, don't worry about these extra lines. We can clean these up later. So I'm going to draw the vertical lines up and decide how tall I want my dresser to be. I want it to be right under the window, so I can go ahead and draw in that line there. And just connect these lines. Go ahead and draw my other guide to complete the back. And there we go, we have a dresser. We can divide that down the middle. And now we have an area for drawers. We could also do an inset kind of thing, like so, where we could have a little bit of a boundary and then divide that down the middle. If you want to put some handles, you can draw guides for where you want your handles. We'll divide that rectangle and the one below it. So now we have center points for our handles. You can draw guides for the width to help us make these circles the right size. You don't have to get it exactly perfect. It's up to you how tight you want to make this drawing. I want it to look a little loose, so I'm not going to worry about doing it exact. If you hold Shift while you draw, you'll break out of this line drawing mode. So I'm just holding Shift now. Make sure you get your guides in the right place. You may have to zoom in a little bit to see where you're trying to go. Now we have some handles. If you start to get confused and you want to erase some lines, you can go ahead and do that. I think I'm going to do that now. I'm going to erase a few. I switched to my eraser using the N key on my keyboard. B is the brush, N is the eraser, V is the straight line drawing mode. And if you hold Shift, you can toggle in and out of freeform drawing and straight line drawing. I have some keyboard shortcuts of Shift P will toggle perspective guided strokes on and off, and just hitting P on its own will toggle between the modes of the perspective guides, like so. I'm hitting P here. So if you find some of these are getting in your way, you can hide them. I'm going to continue cleaning up a few of these lines that we don't need anymore. That looks better. Now we'll go ahead and keep adding to our sketch, and we will go ahead and put another object in here. This will be a house plant. So we'll just draw a square. Decide how tall we want it to be. This will be the pot. Be a square-shaped pot. It'll sit right there. I'm going to hold Shift so that I can draw a freeform line. Here's the trunk for our house plant. It's going to be somewhere like here. Let's put in a shelf next to our window. It's going to be aligned with the window. So I'm just going to draw a rectangle. I'm going to draw the underneath edge and the back side. And then let's put in a rug on the floor. So that's going to go right about here. Like so. Let's add some electrical outlets to the wall. We'll have the top edge go along here. So draw this guide all the way to your corner of your room, and then mirror it on the other side. And then draw another guide that goes along the bottom edge. Then you can put in your rectangles for your light socket. You can hold Shift to put in the plug areas. Now there may be some cases where you're going to want to center things on these faces here, these rectangles that are in perspective. The best way to do that is to make an X through all of these boxes. You connect one corner to another corner. That'll give you a center point and you'll know exactly where the center is. If you want, you can keep subdividing those squares to get more and more units. So we'll go ahead and do that here. We'll switch to straight line drawing mode with V on our keyboard, and we'll tap in one corner and connect it to the other corner. We'll hit B to break that line, because if you don't, you're going to keep drawing segments. That's going to get kind of annoying after a while. So make sure you hit B, then hit V to switch back to straight line drawing mode, click in the other corner and connect it, and then hit B to break out of that line drawing mode. Now you can continue doing this for the rest of these faces if you want to. Try to get the center point for them. So I'm going to do that on the plant here. I'm going to hit V, hit B to break it, hit V again, and just keep hitting B and V as much as I need to. I know it sounds like you have to do it a lot, and you do, but that's just the way that this tool works. If you can't exactly see the edge, you can just guess where it's at. I'm going to hit B to switch to freeform drawing, and then I'm going to hit N and hold Shift. That will let me erase this extra line that I have here. I'm going to erase that corner that's behind it too. Let's go ahead and divide these windows so that we can put a little bit of a frame down the middle. So I'm going to use that rough ink brush. I'm going to hit V on my keyboard. I'm going to connect the corners, hit B to break, hit V again, and I'm going to do that for the other window as well. There we go. Now we have a center point for both of these windows. Now we can go ahead and hit B to go back to freeform drawing. If we don't hold shift, then we'll get that nice vertical line. Unless you're going for kind of a weird tilted view, you want your vertical lines to be straight to have everything be in proper perspective here. So we'll go ahead and draw in a little indication of a frame. Maybe there's panes of glass that slide back and forth, and this is just the edge of that. And if you want, you can go ahead and draw on the edges of these windows a little sharper. So that's all we need for our rough sketch. We can go ahead and exit out of this perspective mode by clicking on the perspective guides tool, turn it off, switch back to your brush with B, and if you're still locked in that perspective guided strokes mode, you can turn it off here. We want to just go through with our eraser now and erase anything that we don't need. Okay, so now we have a really good rough sketch. We can turn down the opacity of that and go ahead and sketch over this again. Now it's up to you if you want to freehand sketch this to make it a little more loose, or you could keep using the guides, but we're basically going to repeat the same process, but just do a much cleaner drawing. I'm going to go ahead and time lapse this and we'll catch up when I'm done. Alright, so I have my cleaner sketch completed. I can go ahead and just delete the old sketch and just finish cleaning up this one. Let's go ahead and start adding some color now. We'll keep the sketch here as the top layer and we'll add a color layer below it. Let's call this color 1. We're going to do several layers of color. So we're going to start with the background colors first. So let's go ahead and start filling in here. Let's make a selection using the lasso selection set to polygonal mode. To go ahead and make a selection of this dresser. Anything that has straight edges like this is much easier to fill in this way. Double click to close that selection, and then we can go ahead and fill with that brown color. Do Control D to deselect. If you need to, you can go in with a brush like the scratchboard and clean up the edge if you didn't get it perfect. Let's go ahead and fill in that shelf the same way that's above it. Let's go ahead and do these outlets. We'll do these in a gray color. These are so small that it's just probably easier to go ahead and paint them in without using a selection, but I'll make that your call on what you want to use a selection for and what you don't. I'm going for objects that don't overlap each other, so we could go ahead and do this division on the window frame. And it's easier just to paint this in without doing a selection because it's a small, easy to fill shape. Let's go ahead and do this light fixture up here at the top. This might be easier to do with a selection. So I'm going to use one there. Just fill it with that gray color. At this point, it doesn't really matter what colors you use to fill things because you can always go through and change them pretty easily. If you overpaint, just use the eraser to fix it. Let's go ahead and add a second layer of color. We'll call it color 2. Let's move that below color 1. Let's use this for the rug, which we will fill using a selection. Let's try this red color. If you didn't get the selection right, just do undo and go back and try it again. There you go, you have a nice rug. We can go ahead and use this same layer for the tree trunk on our house plant here. And let's create another layer. Let's move that below. Let's go ahead and call this walls. We'll create another one and we'll call it floor. Let's use a selection to fill in the floor layer. Notice how I didn't worry about this box here because this box will be on a layer above the floor, so don't worry about that. Let's go to the walls layer. Again, I'm just picking random colors here at this point because I'm going to change them after I'm done filling them in. Let's create another new layer and let's put it above the floor layer. Let's call it color 3. and we'll use the scratchboard tool along with the polygonal selection to fill in this box. It's up to you if you want to use fill, or you can use the scratchboard tool to just paint over it, but what you want to have is a fully opaque fill here. Let's go ahead and use this same layer to put in some edges on the windows. Let's go ahead and fill in the leaves of this plant. We can do that on the color 1 layer. This is going to be a little trickier to fill in, and unfortunately there's not a quick and easy way to really fill this in with a paint bucket, so you'll just have to paint it in manually. We'll use the scratchboard tool and we'll just paint. We'll be loose about it because we can always go in and erase. Of course, you don't want to be too loose, but just make sure that you fill it in all the way to the line. If you overpaint, just erase using the eraser. Go right along all of the edges first, because the middle is really easy to fill in with a big brush. I'm going to switch to the eraser with N and just go in and clean up any of that overpainting. Keeping a little bit of overpainting is probably fine if you want that sort of look for your artwork. This isn't the only way to draw rooms. You could draw it in a different medium if you wanted to, or a different style. This is really just a demonstration of how to use perspective guides to do any sort of artwork. There we go, I think that looks good. I'm going to zoom back out and evaluate what we have. If you wanted to, you could separate the edges of this shelf here, but I'm not going to worry about it because I'm not going to add too much detail to that. It's fine to stay on its own layer there. I will go ahead and add these knobs on a layer. We'll need to add a layer above color 1. Let's just call it knobs, and we'll fill those in using the scratchboard tool. You want to keep your ink or your pencil on top, that way everything else gets painted underneath it. And use as many layers as you need to separate overlapping objects. Now if we want to add some shading, we can return to color 1, that's these areas here. We can turn on preserve transparency, which will keep us from painting outside of this edge that we already defined. So I think I like this brown for these shelves. Maybe we'll base everything around this brown when we choose the rest of the colors. So I'm going to hold Alt on my keyboard to sample that brown. I'm going to make it darker and shift the hue a little bit darker. I'm going to use the scratchboard tool and I'm going to test this and see if I like this color. I think maybe I want it a little more dull, like that. And I'm just going to fill this in, just using freeform drawing with this brush. Now we know this is going to be darker because this is the underside. I think for this piece, since most of the objects are over on the right side, we'll have the light coming from this left window here and it'll be a daylight scene, but you could really do any kind of lighting that you want. If you do use the interior light, you would want your lighting to be based on that, which would, in this case, would be center here. So if we know that our light's coming from the left, then the right side of this shelf should be pretty dark. We'll go ahead and make it a little bit darker and fill that in. Let's go ahead and do that same thing for the dresser. We will use this underside color here to just go ahead and paint in a shadow side. Now I'm not going to do too many levels of shading here. I'm going to do this pretty simple, but if you wanted to, again, you could separate this face onto its own layer. That would make it easier to go ahead and shade it if you wanted to add three-dimensional or more realistic shading to it using something like an airbrush. Now what you can do is you can use a smaller brush to go ahead and draw in a few accents to the edges here on this. So I'm going to turn on perspective guided strokes. If you find that you're going to be working on this for a long time, you want to make sure that you save this as a RIF and not a PSD. And you'll probably want to go ahead and save your perspective guides as a preset if you're not using one of these standard modes here. That way, if you restart this, your guides will all be where you left them. I'm going to darken these edges here to make these stand out. Do the underside here of this drawer. Then let's hold Alt on the keyboard to sample that color. Let's make it a little bit lighter. To add a highlight to this drawer. And we could add one to the dresser itself. So we're adding light to the side that's facing towards the light source, and we're adding shadow to the opposite side. Could do the same thing with that shelf and add a highlight to that. Now I see there's a layer we forgot. We didn't add in the sky, so let's go ahead and add that above the floor. We'll call it color 4. Turn off preserve transparency and go ahead and use a selection to fill that in. There we go. Now we have a sky in the background there. Let's go ahead and just name that sky since that's what's on that layer. If you wanted to, you could do that for the rest of the layers as well. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just use preserve transparency to go ahead and fill the rest of these layers with appropriate colors. So I'm just going to pick whichever colors I like. You can always change the colors later after you fill them in using some of the effects commands, so don't worry about getting it perfect initially. So preserve transparency is on. I'm going to start with the walls and fill those in with a color. With this fill command active, you can always go through and hunt too and pick different colors if you want. But I think we're going to go with something standard like a beige color. We'll go to OK, and I'm going to go ahead and fill in the rest of these layers. Now these layers that have multiple objects on them will of course have to use the scratchboard tool because the fill command will fill everything, so I'll have to watch out for that. So everything's filled in. It has a little bit of shading. Let's add some shadows for this rug and some of these objects. Go to the floor layer, we'll right click on it, we'll do select layer content. You can also get to that through this shortcut here. Turn off preserve transparency, create a new layer. We'll call it floor shadows. Make it a multiply composite method. Use Control-Shift-H on your keyboard to hide that selection. Select the scratchboard tool, hold Alt to sample the floor color, pick a darker color, and shift the hue a little bit. Go ahead and use perspective guided strokes for the edge of the rug here. Switch to the eraser with N, clean up the edge a little bit. We'll hit B to switch back to freeform drawing mode. Put in a little bit of shadow over here. Now light's coming from that direction, so we can have a projected shadow here. Maybe we could do the same for this box here. Now let's do something similar with the walls here. We will select layer content on the walls layer, create a new layer, call it walls shadow, make it a multiply composite method so that it blends with the background. Control-Shift-H to hide the selection, and then go ahead and paint with the scratchboard. Let's do a shadow from this shelf here. We won't be able to use our guides because it's not quite the right lighting scenario. So we'll switch to straight line drawing mode with V, click on this corner here, and this will be the angle of our shadow. We'll switch to regular drawing mode, and we will turn off perspective guided strokes and just go ahead and fill in very carefully this shadow here. Let's add a little bit of shadow behind this box here. Add a little bit to the outlets, and then maybe we'll vignette the corners a little bit too on the floor shadows layer. Let's go ahead and get a selection from the floor again. Hide the selection with Control-Shift-H, go to the floor shadows layer, and we'll paint there. Now we can also blend some of this. We can use the coarse oily blender or the diffuse blur. I'm going to use coarse oily blender. Your paper texture will affect the way this blends, so you may have to play with that setting. Just going to use this to put in some nice texture here. Blending kind of more or less in the direction that my vanishing point's going as well here. Break that up a little bit. I'm going to go to the wall shadow layer. I'm going to deselect my selection with Control-D. Put in a little bit of blending here and on the shelf as well. Now the last thing we'll do is we'll add some texture to our rug here. And it can be helpful if you have things that are on a rectangular plane that's in perspective to draw them straight on and then distort them into perspective. So we'll create a new document. This can be the same size as what you're doing here. That way it'll be the right resolution. It's always better to do it bigger than too small. All we need to do is use black and white here, so we can select a dark color and use something like the sponge to go ahead and paint over this with a varying brush size. We want this to look like carpet, which is just a bunch of fractals. I think this looks pretty good. So if you want, you can go ahead and save this. That way you can use it for another time if you want. You can save it as a PSD or a RIF, it's up to you. I'm going to save it as a PSD and I'm going to call it rug. We'll do a select all and we will do a copy. We'll go to the window menu and go back to our room composition. I recommend that you save at this point in case pasting has some negative effect on what you're doing. We'll go to the topmost layer here, right underneath the sketch, and we will paste using Control V, or you could use the paste in place command. And then we'll go to free transform and we will scale this down. You want to hold shift while you scale it down to make sure you don't squish it. Try to get it just slightly bigger than the rug here and position it to where it covers it mostly. Go ahead and switch to the distort mode. And you want to drag each of these corners to match the rug. So I'm going to start with this easy one here. Do the next one. There is one that is off screen, but that's okay. You can kind of see where it is if you just keep dragging and you watch the two edges. You'll see when they line up. Something like that looks good. We'll commit that transformation by clicking the check. And if you need to nudge it around, you can use the arrow adjuster and the arrow keys on your keyboard just to nudge it into place. And we want to blend this with the color underneath, so we change the composite method to either multiply, screen, or overlay. Let's try overlay and see. I think that looks pretty good. You can see what multiply looks like. If you want a darker rug, you use multiply. If you want a lighter rug, you use screen. Let's try multiply and then just turn the layer opacity down a little bit. Now we have a nice texture. Let's look at one more way to add texture, which is a little quicker, and we can use this for views that are kind of more or less straight on. So let's rename this layer rug texture. Let's create a selection from the floor using select layer content. Hide the selection with Control Shift H, create a new layer and move it above floor shadows and call it floor texture. Make that a multiply composite method. We'll select a dark gray like this and we'll use the sponge. Now you want to use a smaller diameter brush in the background and a larger diameter brush in the foreground and paint straight across horizontally. Make your brush bigger, straight across, and bigger and straight across. That way your texture will be in perspective. So you could have like a floor that's textured if you want. You can turn down the layer opacity. This gives it a nice little bit of texture there. You could blend it if you want to. These floor shadows, if they're too intense, you can turn them down. I think that helps. Same thing with the wall shadow, if that's too intense. But see, when you start using all these layers, it gives you a lot of room to experiment. It's more fun to build this as you go along rather than have to conceptualize it all from the beginning, I think. Let's add some final texture to our dresser here and then we'll call it good. So that dresser is on the color 1 layer. So we'll do a selection of that using select layer content. We'll have to be careful where we paint here because we might overpaint on some stuff that we don't want to paint on. We'll create a new layer, we'll call it wood texture. This will be a multiply composite method. Control Shift H to hide the selection. Use that same sponge and that same dark color. I'm just going to paint over this lightly, and then I'm going to use the coarse oily blender to blend this in the same direction to give it a sense of wood grain. Like so. Now we have a nice wood effect. And just so the shelf isn't left out, put a little bit of texture over that using the sponge as well. And now let's add a few finishing touches and we will wrap this piece up. I'm going to fill in the sky and give it a little detail. I'm going to use Control D to deselect any active selections, turn on preserve transparency, and use the airbrush to just add a nice gradient. I'm going to go to the knobs layer and I'm going to add some highlights to those using the scratchboard tool. And I think we have a finished piece. Now, of course, you can keep adding to yours and keep adding more texture and more shading and more objects. It's really up to you how far you want to take this. If you enjoyed this episode of Draw This, take a quick second to like this video and share it with your friends. And don't forget to click the subscribe button to see my new videos as they're released. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Tuesday for a new episode of Draw This.